Apologize to my colleagues. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Good afternoon. I'm Assemblyman Ken Cooley. I thank you for this hearing of the Select Committee on Foster Care. And thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I thank my colleagues for joining us here. So I'll invite their comments in a minute, but to get ourselves underway, I'm very grateful for folks who are here to support the topic of how do we strengthen the foster care system for youth in our state, at-risk youth. Today we are going to be focusing initially on the different types of support we offer through the foster care system. Support through places with relative caregivers. Are we doing enough to ensure that the first placement with a relative is stable and productive? We'll then be looking at support for our foster youth and education through foster care services. Talk about the problem of the achievement gap that affects kids coming through the foster care system, and look at areas where foster kids lag behind to kind of understand where do they fall down, how might we bring forth ideas to assist them. And we'll be talking about services to foster youth, and we will hear from foster youth as the day advances. We'll be discussing dependency court and how that system works, and the players in that, and how to provide support for the dependency court system, and looking at how we help foster care youth if they end up in the juvenile justice system, and support and intervene with them. And we'll have time for public comment at the end. So again, I just want to thank you, and we will get going. But I thank my colleagues here, Assemblymember Lopez, Irwin, Gibson, and Stone, and invite them, and Mr. Cooper. Sorry, Mr. Cooper, my seatmate. Got to turn my head. So I invite comments from any of them, and I thank all of them for their work in following this important area. Ms. Lopez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as a former parent, I'm glad to holding this hearing today. I know for the first hand the struggle that foster youth have in our community and the schools, and I would like to thank you, the panelists, for taking the time today to present this important issue.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you very much. Anyone else care to offer a comment as we get going? Mr. Gibson, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm delighted to be here and also to be a member of the Select Committee. I'm dealing with foster care, one of which my family has certainly been a foster provider for many, many years. Not my direct family, but members within my family have taken in children who's been in the foster system for many, many years, and we've seen them matriculate past high school, even to college, to home ownership, to marriage, and things of that nature. And so I'm happy to be part of this much robust conversation as we move forward to look at new innovative ways to address legislation and policies to help foster families move forward. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. Jackie.
Mr. Cooley, I want to thank you for holding this committee hearing on this very, very important topic, and we are familiar with a lot of the dilemmas facing foster kids in Ventura County. It is so important that kids get the proper support and the proper placement, because it can completely change trajectories from going into basically jail to having a great education and being able to move forward in life. And I think it's very important that we look at how we can increase the odds for these most vulnerable kids in our society.
Mr. Cooper?
Thank you, Mr. Cooley, for convening this. I'm glad to be on it. Down in my area where I live in Elk Grove, we have the largest number of foster children in the region. It's a big school district, so a lot of folks down there. We have kids in group homes and also kids in foster homes down there. So I think it's very important. I've been involved with some of the folks down there that run our foster youth program, and making sure they have their needs met, which is very tough on any kid that's in the foster system. So hopefully we come up with some good ideas in collaboration and make these kids' lives better.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Mr. Stone? Well, I want to remark Mr. Stone chaired in my first term here the Human Services Committee, so he has a long and direct history in this. At this point, he chairs the Judiciary Committee, and so he brings a lot of legal resources to the conversation, which are important for the way the programs operate. I guess the personal narrative, which I have not yet said, is in my own family, the foster care system enters in through grandkids. I have 3 grandchildren, 2 of whom are through the foster care system, Anna and Benjamin, 3 and 1 at this point, and fully adopted through the Sacramento County system. My kids, my son and his wife. So with that, I thank you all for being here, and I will invite Angie Schwartz to open.
Thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember Cooley and members of the Select Committee. My name is Angie Schwartz. I'm the Policy Director with the Alliance for Children's Rights. We're a public interest law firm that represents foster children in Los Angeles County. The majority of the children we represent are placed with relatives, most of whom are senior citizens living on fixed and meager incomes. We greatly appreciate the ability to speak with you today about the importance of relatives to our foster care system and the things we must do to better support them and therefore retain them. Because as it stands right now, we're treating foster children in the care of relatives differently, providing them less support and undermining the critical role that relatives play and should be playing in our child welfare system for all children, but especially for older youth when their parents can't play that role. Caring for a child in foster care is challenging. These children have been abused, neglected, they've experienced trauma, and they have significant needs. But research shows when they can be placed in the home of a family member, they're more likely to stay connected with siblings, with their community, with their friends and schools. They have less health and mental health problems. They're more likely to reunify with their parents, and if they can't reunify, they're more likely to have permanency and stability in that home of the relative. And for those reasons, state and federal law require, whenever possible, that we place in the home of a relative first. But despite this preference, in California, our laws and policies frustrate the ability of these relatives to do a good job. To illustrate exactly how relatives get the short end of the stick here in California, I want to start with a story. If you can't see, we have handouts too, so you should have it there. Great. So Anthony is 16 years old and was removed from his mother when he was 8. He's diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder. He's taking psychotropic medications. He's having trouble at school. He's had temper tantrums and destruction of property. He's got night terrors, so he can't share a bedroom with other children. He needs very intensive supervision. So let's assume that Anthony is not eligible for federal foster care benefits, and I can never say that without explaining what I mean by federal foster care benefits. Federal eligibility is this arcane term that we use to draw down federal funds for just a portion of our foster kids. It's not based on the child's needs. It's based on the home that the child is being removed from, and we look at whether or not those parents that the child is being taken from would have met welfare standards, but not by today's standards, but whether or not they would have met the welfare standards that existed back in 1996. So it doesn't make any sense, and what you need to know is fewer and fewer children are federally eligible every year. For children placed with non-relatives, it's a distinction without a difference, because if your child is not federally eligible and is placed with a non-relative, we pay state foster care benefits in the exact same amount as the federal foster care benefits. But for relatives, it makes a big difference because California denies state foster care benefits to relatives. And what that meant until very recently is that a relative taking in a child who wasn't federally eligible was sent to the local welfare office to endure the often onerous process of applying for CalWORKs benefits, which provide far less support. Fortunately, because of the efforts of this body, the legislature took a historic step last year to try to get at this disparity and created the Approved Relative Caregiver Funding Option Program, also known as ARC. Because of ARC, for the first time this year, most of our relatives are going to be able to get support equal to the basic foster care rate. Unfortunately, because ARC is an optional program, not every county has opted in. At last count, 16 counties have not yet opted into the program. And relatives in those counties that haven't opted in will still have to go down to CalWORKs to apply for the funding that they need. So under the new system, we still have disparities between our relatives and non-relatives based on whether or not the county has opted into ARC. So in Del Norte County, which is the county that hasn't opted into ARC, the family would get $369 a month to support Anthony. And that very same family, if they're in LA County, who has opted into the ARC program, they would be up to the basic rate, which is $838 a month. So it's a significant difference. ARC was a tremendous benefit to our families. But what you can also see from this chart is that ARC only partially responds to the funding disparities because it only provides relatives access to that basic foster care rate. Basic foster care rates cover things like food, clothing, shelter, supervision for a typical child, not a child like Anthony that has very intensive needs. For that, we have a specialized care system here in California, and specialized care is our system to stabilize children in family settings and allow them to be successful in a family placement. The problem is we deny specialized care to relatives caring for children that are not federally eligible. So you can see there the disparities again. So within LA County, which has opted into ARC, that non-relative would be getting roughly double the amount of assistance to care for Anthony than the relative would who's stuck at the basic foster care rate. And of course, the disparity in the non-ARC counties between relatives and non-relatives is even more extreme. It makes little sense that we deny specialized funding to relatives. It's our specialized care system that allows a family to go to the heroic lengths we're asking them to go to stabilize a child and support children with intensive needs. They have to take time off work, attend appointments and therapies. Some are retiring early so that they can be there 100% of the time. Others spend significant amounts of time and resources addressing their daily needs, getting specialized therapy, getting access to enrichment programs, and that's just a few of the examples. Denying relatives access to this funding means we're setting our relatives up to fail. And it may explain why we've seen a steady decline in our kinship placements for older foster youth over the last 15 years, and a corresponding increase in the number of young people placed in congregate care. The rising number of youth in group homes has obviously been a huge concern of the legislature, and for good reason. In 2012, the legislature required the Department of Social Services to convene the Continuum of Care Reform Work Group to develop recommendations to reduce our reliance on group homes and make sure that all children can be raised in family settings. And to do this, we have to make sure there are enough families available to support these young people. We submit that relatives, if properly supported, can and will provide many of these homes. We know they want to. They're family. But it's no secret that kids get more expensive as they get older, and adolescence is a difficult enough time without being compounded by the trauma that these young people have experienced. Without proper support, families who step up to care for these youth often fail, and for the older youth, they often wind up in group homes. We've seen this in our own work far too often. So what do we do? In the short term, two things. First, we make sure that all relatives get access to the funding that's currently available. For counties that have not opted into ARC, we must end the practice of sending relatives to the CalWORKS office in order to navigate that bureaucracy on their own. As our caregivers today will testify, it's a confusing process that leaves them feeling bewildered, frustrated, and usually without any funding in place. Even counties that have opted into ARC, the ARC program is structured right now to require the relatives to apply for the funding. Requiring relatives to fill out additional forms in order to get the funding they need results in them going without crucial benefits, thereby threatening placement stability and the well-being of children. Luckily, there's legislation pending, authored by Mr. Cooley, AB 423, that will require the counties to secure all available funding for the foster child rather than putting that burden on relatives. And I hear it just got off of suspense.
Correct.
That's great. The second thing we must do is immediately remove the barriers in statute that prevent counties from providing specialized care payments to all of our families. Particularly in the context of CCR, it makes no sense to be denying families the very benefits that are intended to support a family taking in a young person with more intensive needs, like a young person stepping down from a group home. Beyond these two short-term solutions, we must ultimately adopt a child-centered foster care rate system that tailors the support and assistance a child receives to their needs, not to whether or not they're related to the person, not to the county where they're residing. There's been a lot of talk in recent months about providing more support to families, but usually that's support through an outside agency, or about doing more engagement of relatives and more family finding. But what's missing from these discussions is how to reform our foster care rate system to make sure that all families, relative or not, get the funding they need. No child who's experienced the trauma of being removed from their home should experience secondary trauma when they're removed from the relative that they had been placed with in a stable placement just because that relative doesn't qualify for the funding they need to support the child. It is our sincere hope that as we move to make significant reforms to our child welfare system, we take a close look at our foster family home rates and move towards a truly child-centered system. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Very good. Any immediate comments people want to make, kind of by way of response? I mean, I think in general, I'll just make the observation that each of us seated here is a part of a longer-term group of lawmakers. We had the potential to be here a dozen years. I think when you look at the foster care area, we are dealing with a very complex system. It's based on federal and California law. And I think the purpose of a hearing like today, you know, we've put together extensive resources in the binder. It's a real compendium of resources. I encourage you to ask a member of your staff just to kind of learn what's there and take note of it as a general matter of public policy. I think the opportunity for our group of legislators is to kind of understand what is the state of the law, which is sort of bequeathed to us by our predecessors, and then with a view to kids, think about if we had the chance to kind of reshuffle the deck a little bit to reconceptualize how this all works to get the best possible outcome for kids. That's really our job. And we may not arrive at a conclusion at the end of today's hearing. This is something that's grown up through many accretions of law and change over time, nip and tuck here under different constraints of the system. But really the opportunity is to understand what's going on and try to think it through from the standpoint of kids, what would work best, and then try to bring that forward, which will entail some advocacy with the federal level, which has its own challenges. But the fact is we are California, and we can generally do more within our own borders, our own structures of government, than many other states, just because of the scale of things here. So I thank you for putting this forward, this discrepancy between being federally eligible and the way the rules work and the practical reality, which we turn to now,
Right.
with your witnesses.
And Chair, I do have a question.
Yes.
So while the group care numbers have increased for older kids, what has it done for the younger kids compared to group home versus kin?
The group home numbers for younger kids have gone way down. That we do not use congregate care very much for younger children anymore, and I don't have the percentages, but I do know that I think it's around 80% of young people that are in group homes are 14 or older. And also in terms of relative placements for our younger youth, we haven't seen the decline in relative placements for younger kids. In fact, there's been a slight uptick in the number of relatives for the very youngest kids, the 0 to 5-year-olds, and there's been a slight decline if you take into account like the 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. But really the number of relative caregivers for the younger kids, young children under 10, have been stable and increased a little bit.
So the uptick is really for kids 14 and above?
Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Rubel?
Yes. I don't know if I can follow Angie, but she kind of set the bar high there.
Yeah, and introduce yourself and
Yes.
carry it away.
My name is Bob Rubel. Good afternoon. My name is Bob Rubel. I'm from Orange County, and I've been solely caring for my niece for the past 12 and a half years. Before I made that phone call on September 26, 2002 to 911 in an effort to protect my niece, I had a life, I had plans, and I had dreams. Then I made a call that would drastically change my life and turn it completely upside down. I had assumed that by calling 911 I completed my job. The next day I received a phone call from my county saying that there was no one else who could or would care for my niece, and if I did not step up, she would remain a short time longer in group care and eventually be placed in a stranger's home. As I look back over the 12 and a half years, I can now see that there was a lot more that could have and should have been done to make my niece's placement into my home more successful and seamless. I love my niece, and I'm glad I was able to step up for her and provide her a safe, stable home. But the lack of important information and the lack of proper support I received made a difficult situation more difficult then and later in our future. At the very beginning, I was given little to no information and was forced to start trying to figure things out on my own. I did not know who all the people were that were suddenly calling me. I had difficulties with my niece's school, with doctors, in large part because I didn't have any other document than a placement agreement that I hastily signed before I was rushed down to pick her up out of congregate care. It was very difficult to do my best when I did not know what I was supposed to do or how to do it. So I basically started winging things on my own, which was basically in the best interest of my niece. I spent many, many hours on the phone trying to extract information from my county that I needed. I also had a roller coaster ride when it came to the funding. I was also told I was federally ineligible after about 2 weeks. I never understood why I wasn't federally eligible. It just stopped. Nobody to this day has ever been able to explain to me, other than Angie, why that happened to me 12 years ago. So I was also told to go down and apply for welfare, non-needy benefits, CalOpt, all these sorts of things that were just crazy for me to do at a time when I was trying to get her stabilized in a home. Nobody would help me, and I was left to figure it out all on my own. Sorry about that. There were so many other traumatic things going on with my niece at the time, and trying to understand this new world of foster care while helping my niece settle into a home and deal with all the emotions she was trying to cope with. I couldn't sort out the confusion, and I was being told about the funding.
How old was she when she was placed with you?
8. Fortunately for me, I had the means to financially support my 8-year-old niece, so the delay and lack of understanding about why I was supposed to be eligible for not funding did not create a crisis for me. I cannot imagine how other relative caregivers who do not have these means would survive for the months of uncertainty. I can only imagine how many placements failed due to the confusion and the lack of immediate support. And I have met many other relative caregivers who have not been able, they're not as fortunate as me, and have experienced extreme financial stress, and even some who had to stop providing a home for their kin because they just couldn't make ends meet. After about 20 months, it became clear that reunification was not going to be an option. I was asked about my permanency plan. I decided to take the path of legal guardianship, which I did, as I didn't want to try to adopt because of the already fragile family situation. And my niece didn't want to be adopted. I was her uncle. She didn't want to be my daughter. Once I took guardianship over my niece and the dependency case closed, and she was no longer in foster care, I started receiving something called kin gap funding, which I believe was equal to the foster care payment at the time. This was helpful, although it baffled me that when she was in foster care, I got no funding. But once the case closed, the funding started. But all the other services and contact with my county and support stopped. The only time I ever heard from my county after that was once a year for verification from the kin gap eligibility worker to make sure our address hadn't changed, my niece was still living with me, and she was going to school full time. The lack of support after exiting kin gap was tough. When my niece reached 12, all hell broke loose. Adolescence, puberty, past trauma that I had no tools to deal with at the time. But I remember going to a permanency class the county required me to do to become a legal guardianship. And I was told at that time, should I ever need services again, she would be able to be eligible for them. So I called my kin gap worker, the eligibility worker, to inquire how to obtain therapy for her. I was told to contact my caseworker. My case was closed. I no longer had a caseworker. So after about a week or two of calling and speaking to, they use a term called officer of the day, I finally got some sort of a referral to where I could find services for her. Then I found out it would take 2 or 3 months to get her in to see a therapist. Once I got her in, the appointment they made me was in the middle of the school day. She was already having issues in school. I couldn't take her out. So we finally got her into therapy, and she was requested for me to look for the psychiatric services. At that time, again, there was a 3-month wait. I was unable to do that, so I decided to pay that out of my pocket at my own expense rather than wait. She was going downhill pretty fast. But many families wouldn't have that luxury. What I see would be a real threat to the ongoing stability of their permanent home. What could be done to improve these services, in my mind, is I know there's some money now, or there's going to be some money for specialized care funding, but since I was related to my niece, I would not have received much help at all. This issue should be fixed because families should not receive less funding because they are related. As a result of my experience, I have started my own support groups to help others in my situation. I was constantly being approached by other relative caregivers that were sent to FFA or agency contracted agencies for relative support, only to find that we met in the parking lot and exchanged our own information and started to do it all on our own. I still do this today. Most of the FFA agencies that were hired that I've been involved with didn't have relative caregivers on staff. They had it's a completely different situation, and it wasn't very supportive. So I'm supportive of the efforts underway here to get families like mine the support that they need in navigating the child welfare system and access and services. I certainly could have used case management, someone helping me to navigate the school system and medical system, and more support in helping me learn how to deal with my niece's trauma. But it's also clear to me to be truly successful, we need to also reform our system with regard to how families are funded. Relatives that step up to care for children should not go for months without any financial support and should be able to access all the same benefits and specialized funding to non-relatives. Last I was told in my county, 60% of the formal placements are with relatives. Our system must be responsive to the needs of the family that are asking to take on the responsibility of caring for our children. AB 12 was a huge step forward and something that my niece and I felt a direct effect from. My niece will be 20, if I get emotional, I'm sorry. My niece will be 21 in July. She's in her third year of college, and she still can have access to Medicare till she's 26, and that is absolutely huge. Thank you for AB 12. But this was just the beginning. There was a lot of work that can and should be done to help out all the families like mine that are struggling with the system that's currently in place. It makes me so happy to see firsthand that these next steps are going to be put in place with bills like AB 403 and AB 423. In my journey, I've heard so many say the system will never change. I can proudly go back to my county in Orange and say that there's a lot being done to fix and make the system better. So I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here today and for helping the future of our innocent children.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rubel. Any questions for Mr. Rubel? Very good. Priscilla, thank you for being with us today.